The rain splattered against the windshield like 1,000 tiny claws, scratching to get in. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel, the leather gloves creaking with the motion. The road stretched ahead, slick with water and illuminated by the cold fluorescent glow of the hospital's rooftop sign. St. Vincent's Medical Center was a name that once inspired confidence. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this town, not in this job, not in this life. I took the job out of guilt, and guilt had a way of clinging to me like the scent of antiseptic on my gloves. When I was a paramedic, I made a call that cost a life. Now I inspect places like this, making sure no corners get cut, no patient gets left behind. But redemption doesn't come cheap, and the job they gave me today felt like a debt collector knocking at my door. The air in the quarantine ward tasted stale, as if the place hadn't known fresh oxygen in years. Fluorescent lights hummed weakly, casting everything in a yellowish pallor. Each step I took echoed off the tiled floor, a reminder of just how empty the place felt, despite the rows of patients tethered to machines that beeped and whirred without enthusiasm. Now it was nothing but a tomb that hadn't finished collecting its dead. A man stood at the entrance, thumbing through his notebook like the scribbled words might hold the building's creeping dread at bay. "You the inspector?" he asked, his voice rough and heavy, like gravel scraping pavement. "Yeah," I said, pulling out my ID. "You the detective?" "Detective Harris," he confirmed, offering a hand. It was calloused and firm, a grip that said he'd seen his share of hellholes, maybe even lived in a few. "Glad you made it. There's something unsettling about this ward." I gave a half smile that didn't touch my eyes. "You don't say." He started walking, and I followed. The place wasn't as abandoned as it felt. Patients were lined up in rows, their faces pale and hollow, as if life had already moved on without them. Red veins crept up their arms and necks like ivy on an old house, glowing faintly under the sickly light. Some stared at the ceiling, others muttered to themselves. And then there were the whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but they were there. A low, continuous hum that set my teeth on edge. "This illness," Harris said, nodding toward one of the patients, "came out of nowhere. No official name for it yet. Symptoms started with fatigue, then the veins, then..." He trailed off, and I didn't need him to finish. The still bodies in the far beds told the rest of the story. "And no one's figured out what's causing it?" I asked, trying to keep my tone professional. Harris shrugged. "Doctors are clueless. Some of the staff think it's not natural." "Natural or not, I'm here to do my job," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Let's start with the files. I need to know exactly what's been going on here." He handed me a manila folder as we stepped into a small office. The smell of disinfectant was stronger here, almost masking the underlying stench of sickness. I flipped through the pages, taking in the details. Onset times, symptoms, deaths. Too many deaths. "You notice anything unusual?" I asked without looking up. Harris hesitated, then leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "Depends on what you call unusual. Beds moving on their own. Patients talking about a nurse that doesn't exist. Lights going out when they shouldn't. And then there's..." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "What?" I pressed. "Some of the staff say there's a figure," he said finally. "Shows up in the shadows. Tall, skeletal. Could just be stress getting to them, but..." He shook his head, as if trying to dislodge the thought. "I've been doing this job too long to dismiss anything outright." I glanced at him, gauging his sincerity. Harris wasn't the type to scare easy, which made his unease all the more unsettling. "All right," I said, closing the folder. Let's take a look around. We started with the main ward. I walked the rows, examining patients as discreetly as I could. Their breaths were shallow, their skin clammy. A man in his 60s gripped the edge of his bed like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. A young woman with a shaved head stared blankly at her IV drip, her lips moving in silent prayer. And then there was the man in bed, 14. He was younger than the others, maybe mid-30s, but his condition was worse. The red veins pulsed visibly, snaking up his neck and into his cheeks. His breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling as if each inhale was a battle. When his eyes flicked open, they locked onto mine with an intensity that made me freeze. "You're the inspector," he rasped. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "That's right. What's your name?" He didn't answer. Instead, his hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with surprising strength. "Listen," he whispered urgently. "You have to stop it. It's feeding on us. You can't let it—" He broke off, coughing violently. Blood flecked his lips, and the glow in his veins seemed to pulse brighter. "Stop what?" I asked, leaning in despite myself. "What's feeding on you?" "I don't know what it is," he hissed, his voice barely audible. "But it's real, and it's hungry. You have to follow the rules. If you don't—" His grip tightened, his eyes burning into mine. "You'll make it stronger." I glanced over my shoulder at Harris, who stood a few feet away, watching with narrowed eyes. "What rules?" I asked, turning back to the man. He coughed again, and this time his whole body convulsed. 4 rules, he managed between gasps. "Write them down. Don't forget." I fumbled for my notebook, scribbling as he spoke, his voice growing weaker with each word. "Do not let the patient see you cry. Do not turn your back on an empty bed. Mark the veins, then burn the tally. Speak only the truth to the sick." As I finished writing, the man's grip slackened. His head lolled to the side, and the light in his veins dimmed until it was gone entirely. I checked his pulse, but I already knew what I'd find. "Dead," I muttered, my stomach twisting. Harris stepped closer, his face grim. "What did he say?" I hesitated, then handed him the notebook. "Rules," I said simply. "Apparently, they're supposed to keep this thing at bay." Harris read them over, his frown deepening with each line. "And you believe him?" I glanced back at the man's lifeless body, then at the other patients, their red veins glowing faintly in the dim light. The whispers seemed louder now, as if they'd taken notice of me. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I'm not taking any chances." The hallway stretched out ahead of us, a strip of lifeless tile lit by flickering fluorescence. The whispers seemed to follow, growing louder with each step, though every time I turned, there was nothing but patients and empty beds. My boots squeaked against the floor, a sound that did little to mask the weight pressing against my chest. "Do you hear that?" I asked Harris, keeping my voice low. He nodded once, his expression carved from stone. "Been hearing it since the first day I stepped foot in this place. You get used to it." I doubted that. The whispers weren't just sounds. They wormed into your head, threading themselves into your thoughts until it felt like they were your own. A phrase looped through my mind, a voice that wasn't mine, but sounded just close enough. "It's watching." I shook it off and kept walking. The ward was a straight shot, but it felt like we were being funneled, the space tightening with each step. The patients didn't move much, didn't talk, but every so often I caught one of them staring, their eyes following me with unsettling precision before they flicked back to the ceiling or the wall. It wasn't normal. Nothing here was. We passed an empty bed, the mattress stripped bare, the IV stand beside it leaning like a broken tree. I slowed, my gaze lingering. "Something wrong?" Harris asked, his tone sharp. I shrugged. "Maybe. This bed was in the other row earlier." He gave me a look like I'd just told him the sky was falling. "Beds don't move themselves." "Tell that to the one in room 4, I shot back. He didn't respond, just tightened his jaw and motioned for me to keep going. We came to the far end of the ward, where the patients looked worse, if that was even possible. Their veins glowed like dying embers, and their skin clung to their bones. One of them, a woman with sunken cheeks and hair falling out in clumps, reached out to me as I passed. "Please," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves rustling. "Help us." I paused, her hand brushing against my sleeve. Harris stopped too, watching silently. "What do you need?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. Her lips trembled, and tears welled in her eyes. "It hurts. All of it hurts. Is there anything they can do for us?" The first rule hit me like a slap to the face. Do not let the patients see you cry. My throat tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. "I'm here to help," I said, dodging the question. "I just need you to hold on a little longer." The woman's hand dropped, and her eyes glazed over, as if I'd just told her a bedtime story she didn't believe. The whispers surged again, louder this time, almost taunting. "Something's playing games with us," Harris muttered as we moved on. He wasn't wrong. The air felt heavier now, and the lights flickered more frequently. At one point, the shadows in the corners seemed to move, shifting like they had their own intentions. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but the knot in my stomach begged to differ. We turned into another corridor, and that's when I saw it. The empty bed. It was the same one we'd passed earlier, I was sure of it. Same lopsided IV stand, same bare mattress. But now it was here, in a different part of the ward, like it had decided to go for a stroll. I stopped dead in my tracks. "That's the bed." Harris followed my gaze, his eyes narrowing. "You sure?" I nodded, my pulse thudding in my ears. The second rule came rushing back. Do not turn your back on an empty bed. "Stay where you are," I said, pulling a metal tray from a nearby cart. It wasn't much, but the surface was reflective enough to give me a view behind me without turning away. Harris watched me like I'd lost my mind, but he didn't argue. I edged closer to the bed. The tray held out like a shield. The whispers were almost deafening now, a storm of fragmented voices overlapping until they were just noise. Sweat trickled down the back of my neck. The bed didn't move. It just sat there, lifeless and unassuming. But the moment I took my eyes off it, I saw the shadow move in the reflection first. It rose up from the bed, tall and thin, its limbs too long, its face featureless. My grip on the tray tightened as I fought the urge to turn around. It wanted me to look, to give it that sliver of opportunity. I didn't. "Inspector," Harris called from behind me. "What are you—" "Don't," I cut him off. "Just don't." The shadow in the reflection leaned closer, its head tilting unnaturally, like it was curious. The whispers became words now, distinct and cold. "You're not strong enough," it said, the voice impossibly close. "You'll fail, just like before." My hands shook, but I didn't move. "I didn't fail," I whispered, more to myself than to it. It chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that scraped against my nerves. "We'll see." The tray shook in my hands, but I kept the bed in view until the shadow receded, melting back into the frame of the mattress. The whispers softened, retreating like a tide. Harris stepped forward cautiously, his hand on my shoulder. What the hell was that? I lowered the tray, my knuckles white. I don't know, but I have a feeling we're going to find out soon. We regrouped in a small storage room. Harris paced while I caught my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The room smelled like old linen and disinfectant, but it was a welcome reprieve from the oppressive air outside. "What are we dealing with here?" Harris asked finally, his voice laced with frustration. I stared at the rules I'd written down, the ink smudged from my grip. "Something old," I said. "Something that feeds on us. Our fears, our doubts, maybe even our mistakes." Harris snorted, but there was no humor in it. "Sounds like half the people I've arrested." "It's more than that," I said, looking up at him. "This isn't just haunting us, it's using us." His jaw tightened, and he stopped pacing. "So what do we do?" I held up the notebook, the rules etched into the page like scripture. We follow the rules, and we don't screw up. Back in the ward, the patients seemed worse. Their murmurs had grown louder, their movements more restless. I noticed the red veins spreading faster, creeping up to their faces and wrapping around their eyes like masks. One man thrashed in his bed, his limbs jerking violently, as if he was fighting off something unseen. Then I saw the marks on his arm. Thin, red tally marks, etched into his skin like they'd been drawn with a razor. They weren't natural. They were deliberate. The third rule clicked into place. Mark the veins, then burn the tally. "I'll need a lighter," I told Harris, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "What for?" I grabbed a piece of chalk from a supply tray. "Insurance." The chalk felt fragile in my grip, like a splinter of bone. The man's convulsions slowed as I neared, his limbs jerking less, but the red veins glowed brighter, crawling higher toward his face like they wanted to suffocate him. His breath came in wet gasps, each one rattling like the groan of a dying engine. I crouched next to the bed, holding the chalk like a scalpel. "Stay still," I muttered, though I wasn't sure if it was for him or me. Harris stood a few steps back, his hand on his holster, though the gun wasn't going to help either of us. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. "Not even a little," I said. The glow from the veins threw strange shadows across the room, twisting the edges of Harris's face until it looked like someone else was standing there. I blinked hard, forcing myself to focus. The first stroke of chalk dragged across the man's arm like it weighed 100 pounds. It left a pale line that seemed to shimmer under the red glow. The patient's lips parted, but the sound that came out wasn't human. It was guttural, raw, like metal grinding against itself. My stomach turned, but I kept tracing. The veins twisted and branched like rivers on a map, crawling up his forearm, winding around his bicep, spreading across his chest. The whispers returned, louder now, coming from every direction. They weren't just voices anymore. They were accusations. "You're wasting time. He's already dead. You don't even know what you're doing." I ground my teeth and ignored them. The chalk moved faster now, as if it understood what needed to be done. My hand burned from the pressure, but I didn't stop until I'd marked every vein I could see. The lines glowed faintly against his skin, crisscrossing his body like scars. The man went still, too still. His chest stopped rising, his head lolled to one side, and the room fell silent. "Is he dead?" Harris asked. "Not yet," I said quickly. "Hand me the lighter." Harris hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small silver lighter. He tossed it to me, and I caught it with one hand, my fingers trembling. I glanced around the room, searching for something flammable. My eyes landed on the chart at the foot of the bed. Paper. It would have to do. I tore a sheet free, crumpled it, and held it under the man's arm where the tally marks glowed faintly. The lighter clicked open with a sharp metallic snap, and the flame sputtered to life. The heat licked at my hand as I set the paper alight and held it close to the marks. For a second, nothing happened. Then the tally marks flared, brighter than the veins, brighter than anything in the room. The man's body jerked as if he'd been electrocuted, and the whispers surged into a deafening roar. The paper disintegrated in my hand, leaving only ash, but the marks on his skin faded, then disappeared entirely. The glow in the veins dimmed. The man's breathing steadied. For a moment, it seemed like we'd won, and then the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, thick and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I froze, my ears straining for any sound, but the whispers were gone. The silence was worse. "Harris?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here," he answered from somewhere to my left. His voice was steady, but I could hear the edge of fear beneath it. The air felt colder now, and the room smelled like burnt metal. A faint red glow appeared at the far end of the ward, pulsing slowly, rhythmically, like a heartbeat. It wasn't coming from a patient this time. It was coming from the shadows. I stood slowly, the lighter still clenched in my hand. The glow grew brighter, and a shape began to emerge. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. The figure was skeletal, its limbs long and thin, its skin stretched tight over sharp bones. Its chest was a web of glowing veins, each one pulsing with the same rhythm as the light. The thing turned toward us, its face, or what passed for a face, shifting as it moved. Its eyes were empty sockets, but they seemed to see everything. Its jaw opened, revealing a mouth full of jagged teeth that didn't belong in any living creature. It stepped forward, and the temperature dropped even further. The red light cast long shadows across the room, and the patients began to stir, their bodies twitching in unison. "It's waking them up," I said, my voice shaking. "We have to stop it." "How?" Harris asked, his hand on his gun, though he didn't draw it. He knew as well as I did that bullets wouldn't do a damn thing. I thought of the rules. The last one echoed in my mind. Speak only the truth to the sick. The figure stepped closer, its shadow stretching across the ward like it wanted to swallow me whole. The red glow in its chest pulsed in time with the veins crawling up the patients' bodies. My hands shook as the whispers dug deeper into my skull, louder now, more vicious. "You failed them," it hissed, its voice weaving through my thoughts. "That woman, you left her. You watched her die." My breath caught in my throat. I tried to shake it off, but it pushed harder, unrelenting. Images of her face, the woman I couldn't save, flashed in my mind. The look in her eyes when she realized I wasn't coming back for her. "You didn't save her, and you won't save them." "Harris!" I shouted, desperate for his voice to break through the noise. But when I turned, I saw him standing stiffly, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. "Harris," I whispered. His neck jerked, and his face turned toward me. His eyes weren't his anymore, just black pits with faint red veins crawling across his temples. The creature's shadow stretched from his feet like strings, tethering him to the skeletal figure in the corner. "They'll all fail you," Harris said. "You can't save them. You can't even save yourself." He took a step forward, and I stumbled back, clutching the edge of a bed for balance. The whispers became a roar, accusing, taunting, every step he took amplifying the weight on my chest. "Harris, fight it," I yelled. "This isn't you." But the thing laughed, a sound that scraped against my bones. "He's mine now, and soon so will you." The fourth rule echoed in my head. Speak only the truth to the sick. It wasn't just for the patients. Harris was sick now too. Sick with doubt, fear, and guilt. Just like me. I stepped toward him. "You think I failed?" "You're right," I said, my voice trembling. "I let her die. I was scared. I made the wrong call, and it's haunted me every day since." Harris hesitated, his head jerking slightly, as if he was trying to fight it. The creature shrieked, the sound piercing, and its grip on him tightened. "But you know what?" I said, louder this time. "I'm done running from it. I'm done letting you use it against me." I took another step closer toward Harris. "I forgive myself," I said, the words catching in my throat. "And I forgive you, Harris, for all the mistakes you think you've made. You can fight this." Harris collapsed to his knees, gasping as the veins receded from his face. The shadowy string snapped, and the creature staggered back, its form dim and fractured. "You can't win," it snarled, its voice fractured. "You don't deserve to win." "Maybe not," I said, stepping closer. "But I'm taking them back anyway." The red veins in its chest pulsed wildly, then dimmed, then stopped. Its body splintered, crumbling into ash, and the whispers dissolved into silence. Harris coughed, pushing himself up from the floor. His face was pale but human again. What just happened?" he rasped. "You were possessed," I said. "But you fought it. We both did." He nodded weakly, his gaze flicking to the patients. They were still now, their breaths steady. The glow in their veins was gone. "You all right?" Harris asked, his voice rough but steady. I looked at him, then at the patients. The guilt was still there, but it didn't feel like a weight anymore. It felt bearable. "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." The ward was silent now, the air still and almost peaceful. The patients lay quietly in their beds, their skin pale but free of the glowing veins. Harris sat on the floor, his face buried in his hands. He was alive, and he was himself again. I slumped against a wall. My breath came in ragged gasps, but the weight on my chest was gone. For the first time in years, I felt light. Harris looked up at me, his face pale but his eyes sharp. "What the hell was that thing?" I shook my head. "I don't know," I admitted. "But it feeds on fear, guilt, lies. It gets inside you, makes you believe it's your fault, and it's damn good at it." He nodded slowly, glancing at the patients. "Are they gonna be okay?" "They'll live," I said. "At least now they have a chance." I walked out of the ward into the cold night air. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still heavy with clouds. My reflection in the glass door caught my eye as I passed. For a moment, I thought I saw something else there, something dark and writhing. But when I blinked, it was just me. I pulled the notebook from my pocket, running my fingers over the ink-stained pages. The rules had saved us, but they weren't just for the patients. They were for me too. Speak only the truth. I'd finally done it. And for the first time in years, the guilt didn't feel like it owned me anymore. Harris appeared behind me, his face drawn but resolute. "You coming?" he asked. I nodded, slipping the notebook back into my pocket. "Yeah," I said, stepping forward. "Let's go." As we walked away, I glanced back at the hospital one last time. The shadows inside were gone, or so I told myself. But a part of me knew better. Places like that don't just forget, and neither do we.